Much love, and I'm Wayne Johnson with Doc and Queen Ministries. I just want you to be patient with me. I'm going to go off the cuffs today. I'm going to deal with divorce, separation, marriage. I'm not sure what the title is going to be. We're going to come from Matthew. The Lord has definitely worked with me on this particular verses. This is just one of many that I think I'm going to be doing. Today we're going to start with Matthew chapter 19. We're going to deal with verses 7 through 9. And it reads, the Pharisees asked, then why did Moses give a command allowing a man to divorce his wife by writing a certificate of divorce? Jesus answered, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives because you refused to accept God's teachings. But divorce was not allowed in the beginning. I tell you that whoever divorces his wife except for the problem of sexual sin and marries another woman is guilty of adultery. So let's go back into this because we're dealing with divorce, and the Pharisees wanted to trap Jesus with this question because back then they had a big debate. They were some thinking that they could get divorced because of sexual sin. Some were also thinking that, I'm going to just throw it out, if their wife wasn't cooking right, that they could give them a certificate of divorce. But let us look at this and examine this slowly. So again, verse 7, the Pharisees asked, then why did Moses give a command allowing a man to divorce his wife by writing a certificate of divorce? So let's just work with verse 7. And as you see in verse 7, it says Moses gives a command. What Moses says, what Moses commands. The Pharisees asked, then why did Moses, not why God, but why Moses command allowing a man to divorce his wife by writing a certificate of divorce? So they wanted to go back to the law or what Moses said. But this, and we're to be moved not by what per se Moses says, but what God says. Jesus answered, Moses, not God, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives because you refuse to accept God's teaching. So this tells us that God didn't want a husband to divorce his wife, but Moses allowed it because they refused to accept God's teaching. In other words, their hearts were hard. So, since Moses is a human like us, and he isn't God Almighty, he had to find an out for the people who constantly wanted to get a divorce. And this is what Moses allowed. It didn't say this is what God allowed. Jesus answered, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives because you refused to accept God's teaching. Your heart was hard. You didn't want to accept God's teaching. And when we accept God's teaching, we cannot get a divorce. Now, I'm not going to get into the thought of, because sometimes we get married and God didn't ordain it. We did it ourselves. Now, if we did it ourselves, that's different than this. But let's just, for the sake of this right now, not going to go into that teaching right now, but for this, we're going to say that God ordained it, because this is really about God. And they used Moses because, again, reading it over and over again, Jesus answered, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives because you refuse to accept God's teaching. You refuse to accept God's teaching. So that's why Moses allowed them to write a certificate of divorce. However, you didn't supposed to do it because this isn't what God wanted. I'm going to go back to the beginning of 8 and read all the way through. Jesus answered, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives because you refused to accept God's teaching. But divorce was not allowed in the beginning. Was Moses in the beginning? No. Was God in the beginning? Yes. So this tells us, but, and we know when we put the word but in, it erases everything in front of it. But divorce was not allowed in the beginning. See, in the beginning, when God created the union of husband and wife, there was no divorce supposed to come across. But divorce was not allowed in the beginning where God was. But since Moses wasn't where God was, Moses made a provision, but God never did. And so who we're supposed to follow? God or Moses? And so we know the answer is God. So therefore, in the beginning, there was no divorce, or there wasn't supposed to be a divorce. So if God ordained you as husband and wife, you don't supposed to get divorced. You just don't. Because we must understand that when what God puts together, let no man separate. See, God got to put you together. It says what God has put together, let no man separate. That was at the beginning. Now verse 9 says, I tell you that whoever divorces his wife except for the problem of sexual sin, going back to Moses, and marries another woman is guilty of adultery. So that provision allowed divorce based on Moses. But with God, all things are possible. So this shouldn't even come in. But since Moses allowed it, this was one of the prerequisites of allowing it. However, God never intended for a husband to divorce his wife. Why? Because God put them together. And what God puts together, no one is to separate. So who allowed divorce? Was it God or was it Moses? But understand, divorce was not allowed in the beginning. I really hope that this made sense to you, because this is so important, because we see today so many divorced people, even in the Christian church. And all it really matters is if God has put you together, then you are supposed to be husband and wife forever, and to death do you part. Why? Because this is a covenant, not just between you and your spouse. This is a covenant with you, your spouse, and God. And God has a bigger plan than you two just being together. You are doing this marriage piece for the glory of God. You have a special purpose. Take care. God bless. Once again, much love.